Okay, so let's dive into this whole complex legacy of Winston Churchill. We're talking about the Bengal famine of 1943, a tragedy that claimed over 3 million lives in India under British rule.
Yeah, it's really a stark reminder of what can happen when you have these economic policies and wartime priorities. And they just clash,
Yeah,
with basic human needs.
exactly. And we've got some fascinating sources to kind of guide us through this. We have excerpts from this Spanish language video essay. It's called Se pegó el texto, el peor error de Churchill que costó 3 millones de vidas en la India, which translates to the text stuck. Churchill's worst mistake that cost 3 million lives in India. And then, of course, we have the insights of Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist.
Oh, yeah.
He's huge in the field of famine and poverty.
His work was really shaped by this famine.
That's right. That's kind of what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're going to be uncovering the factors that led to this horrific event, the role of British policy, and how this event really kind of changed how we understand famine as a concept.
It all starts in the 1940s. With India under British rule, the country was already prone to famines, largely because of these colonial policies that prioritized these cash crops. We're talking cotton for Britain's textile industry, but also
Linen. The essay actually specifically calls out linen, which is not something you hear a lot,
Right. It's fascinating, isn't it? It really shows how these British interests were just so deeply embedded in India. The focus on these cash crops often came at the expense of growing food staples for the local population, so it left them in a very precarious position to begin with.
And then World War II breaks out.
Exactly, adding even more pressure to the situation. The war intensified demands on India. Churchill was completely laser-focused on supplying British troops, and often that meant diverting resources away from feeding the Indian population.
And that's where Amartya Sen's perspective becomes super crucial. He argues that the Bengal famine wasn't just about a lack of food. In fact, there was enough rice in Bengal to feed everyone.
That's right. Sen's argument. And this really revolutionized how we understand famine. It was more about access and distribution. Certain groups were just disproportionately affected, like landless peasants, fishermen, those who were relying on these low-paying jobs.
Why is that? If there was enough rice, why were these specific groups hit so hard?
They just couldn't afford to buy it. When prices skyrocketed, they were just left behind. The famine really became this brutal magnification of the existing economic inequalities within India, all just completely exacerbated by these wartime policies.
So you have this underlying vulnerability, amplified by these wartime pressures. And then to make things even worse, the British implemented this scorched earth policy.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Of course. So the Japanese army was advancing in Southeast Asia. The British were afraid of an invasion of Bengal, so they decided to destroy resources in Chittagong, which is the region closest to Burma. They thought they were preventing the Japanese from using those resources.
Or intentionally destroying
Both.
food and transportation networks.
Yes. Boats that were used for fishing, vehicles, even elephants were either confiscated or destroyed, all to try and hinder this Japanese advance. But in reality, this scorched earth tactic had a disastrous effect on relief efforts. It further isolated communities that were already really struggling to survive.
It seems so counterproductive. You're trying to win a war, but you're making the famine worse.
And that's exactly what happened. The video essay really drives home the devastation. It describes skeletons lining the roads, families resorting to just desperate measures, children begging for scraps. It's a chilling picture of just how dire the situation became.
And then, on top of all of this, there's this infamous question from Churchill.
Yes. When he was appealed to for aid, he reportedly asked, if food is so scarce in India, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?
It's a really hard statement to grapple with. It seemed to completely disregard the suffering of millions of people.
It does. And this is where Sen's work becomes so important. Because while Churchill might have seen India as just a resource to be leveraged, in Britain's fight for survival, Sen recognized that famine is a complex issue, and it's often driven by inequalities in access, rather than just the total amount of food available.
So even though this famine took place decades ago, the lessons we can learn from it are still incredibly relevant today, especially when we think about this ongoing fight against hunger and poverty around the world. But it wasn't just food shortages, was it? The essay mentions something called a cloth famine as well.
Yes. That's another detail that's often overlooked. With textile production being ramped up to support the war effort, ordinary Indians found themselves without adequate clothing. Imagine that. You're starving. and you don't even have proper clothing to protect yourself from the elements.
It's just heartbreaking to think about. And the ripple effects of these policies were just devastating, not just in the immediate sense of hunger and lack of clothing, but also in the long term. This famine had a really profound impact on India's development, didn't it?
Absolutely. And that's something we should definitely explore further. But before we do, let's delve a bit deeper into the human impact of this tragedy. You know, the video essay gives some truly harrowing accounts of what people endured during this time. One of the most disturbing aspects that the essay highlights is this complete breakdown of social structures as the famine got worse.
Oh, wow. What do you mean by breakdown? Like, how did that manifest?
So people were forced to make just unimaginable decisions just to try and survive. They started selling off their belongings and their land, their homes, anything they could, just to get enough money for food. Families were being torn apart as men just abandoned their wives and children, unable to provide for them.
It's hard to even fathom that level of desperation.
The essay describes Calcutta, the largest city in Bengal at the time, being just overrun with all these starving people. It says this mass of destitute rural people had used their last strength to reach the streets of the populous and chaotic city, only to die on them. Many didn't even make it to the city, dying on the roadsides, leaving behind just a trail of bones and skulls. It really paints a stark picture of just how far-reaching this famine was.
It was like a scene from a dystopian novel.
Mm-hmm.
But this was the reality for millions of people.
Absolutely. And the essay doesn't shy away from those difficult details. It describes corpses just piling up in the streets and in the rivers, overwhelming cremation and burial capacity. People were so desperate for clothing that they resorted to robbing the dead in cemeteries.
It mentions that detail. But people resorting to eating undigested grains found in fecal matter.
It's just a testament to the utter brutality of the situation. You know, people were reduced to their most basic instincts, doing whatever they could just to survive another day. Each of these details
Represents a story of unimaginable suffering. It's important to remember that these aren't just statistics. These were real people, families, entire communities that were ripped apart by this tragedy.
And the impact went far beyond the immediate deaths from starvation. The famine created the perfect conditions for diseases to spread like wildfire. Malaria, cholera, dysentery, smallpox, they all thrived in these overcrowded, unsanitary conditions.
But almost like a vicious cycle. You know, the famine weakens people, makes them more susceptible to disease, and then the diseases themselves further weaken their bodies.
Exactly. It was a nightmare scenario. And to make matters worse, the essay notes that advanced anti-malarial medications and DDT were reserved primarily for the military and what they called priority classes.
That raises a question. Who were these priority classes?
You know, that detail really exposes these deeply embedded inequalities within the colonial system. While millions were suffering, the colonial government seemed more concerned with protecting its own interests than ensuring the well-being of the Indian population. So these priority classes likely included British officials, military personnel, and perhaps even wealthy Indian elites who collaborated with the colonial regime.
So even during this massive crisis, the existing power structures continue to determine who had access to these life-saving resources. It's a chilling example of how inequality can exacerbate suffering during a famine.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to Amartya Sen's work. His analysis of the Bengal famine highlighted that these events aren't simply about the amount of food available, but about the systems that determine who gets to eat. You know, he argued that famine is often a man-made disaster, a consequence of political and economic choices, rather than just natural calamities.
The Bengal famine was a real wake-up call. It forced people to acknowledge the human element in these tragedies. His work challenged that prevailing view of famine as this unavoidable natural disaster and shifted the focus to the role of human agency, political decisions, and economic structures in creating and exacerbating these crises.
And his work has had a profound impact on how we understand and address famine today. It's shifted the focus from simply providing food aid to actually addressing these root causes of food insecurity, like poverty, inequality, and lack of access to resources.
And this leads to a crucial question. What can we do to ensure that something like the Bengal famine never happens again? What lessons can we take away from this tragedy?
Yeah, it's unsettling to think that famine isn't, you know, a relic of the past. We still see it happening all over the world today. You know, the Bengal famine serves as this, like, stark warning that we can't afford to be complacent. Yeah, and while we've made some progress in understanding and addressing famine, millions still suffer from hunger and malnutrition. So the question is, what concrete steps can we take to prevent these tragedies from happening again?
Yeah, what did we learn from the mistakes made during the Bengal famine?
Well, Amartya Sen's work seems like a good place to start. He emphasized that famine often begins with a decline in people's ability to access food, not necessarily a complete shortage of it.
Right, so it's not just about how much food exists, but whether people can actually get to it.
That's a crucial point. It means we need to shift our focus from reacting to famines after they've begun to proactively identifying those early warning signs, monitoring things like economic indicators, food prices, employment levels, debt.
So being able to spot those red flags before it becomes a full-blown crisis.
Exactly. And it's not just about having enough food. It's about making sure that there's equitable access to that food. Remember, the Bengal famine was made so much worse because of these existing inequalities. The landless peasants, the fishermen, those relying on those low-paying jobs, they were the ones hit the hardest.
Because they were already starting from a position of vulnerability.
Exactly. If we want to prevent future famines, we have to address those underlying inequalities. We need to tackle poverty, discrimination, lack of access to resources, to make these communities more resilient and better equipped to withstand shocks like droughts or economic downturns.
The video essay also really highlights the danger of prioritizing military needs over civilian suffering, especially during a crisis. I mean, Churchill's wartime decisions really exemplify that.
You know, that's one of the key takeaways from this whole story. Focusing on military preparedness while neglecting the needs of the people is ultimately harmful. We need to make sure that humanitarian aid and relief efforts are always prioritized, regardless of what's going on politically or militarily. Human life has to come first.
And this is where international cooperation becomes so crucial too, right?
Absolutely. Famines rarely respect national borders, so creating an effective response requires collaboration between governments, international organizations, and NGOs. We need to be willing to share resources, expertise, logistical support to address these complex humanitarian crises. Think about it. The world is so much more interconnected now than it was back in the 1940s. We have the knowledge, the resources, the technology to prevent these kinds of tragedies.
Now we just need the will to act.
Exactly. We need to view the Bengal famine not just as this historical event, but as a lesson about what happens when we don't take action and the urgent need to create a more just and equitable world.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the historical context, the human toll, the policy failures that led to the Bengal famine. We talked about Amartya Sen's work and the lessons we can learn from this tragedy. It's a really powerful reminder that famine is not just a problem of the past. It's a challenge we're still facing today.
Yeah, and the Bengal famine is this somber reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty, but also our resilience. And it offers a glimmer of hope, by understanding the mistakes of the past, by taking this holistic approach to addressing famine, and prioritizing human dignity above all else. We can create a future where food security is a reality for everyone.
That's a great point. Here's a final thought for you all to consider. The Bengal famine shows us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. What can you do in your own life to raise awareness about hunger and food insecurity? How can you contribute to creating a world where everyone has access to the basic necessities for a dignified life? The answers and the responsibility lie within each of us if